uniquely among pre-modern civilizations, has provided not just education for women, but also has provided women educators. And the precedent for this is, as we would expect, the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, mothers of the believers, the wives of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The fact that they, during his lifetime and after his death, became educators is a sufficient indication of the intentions of the lawgiver with regard to the educational value of women. It's frequently pointed out that much of the edifice of Islam actually depends on these women scholars. Without people like Salama, Aisha, Maymuna, Habiba, and other very distinguished female luminaries in the first generation of Islam, Islam as we know it would not exist. Because these people, these women, conserved from the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam so many hadith, so many insights, they offered so many fatwas, they had so much fiqh, that were it not for their testimony, Islam as we know it would not exist. So we can say that the argument that Islam undervalues the testimony of women collapses completely when it becomes evident that the Salaf themselves, and indeed all subsequent Islamic scholarship, esteems a fatwa of a female companion no less absolutely than it esteems the fatwa of a male companion. And the fact that a figure, a rawi or rawiyah in the isnad of a hadith is female is completely irrelevant to the soundness of that hadith. An important point. So the sahabiyat radiyallahu anhunna, and there were many, were the first generation of women scholars in Islam, and really the first women scholars on a substantial scale that the world has ever seen. After the death of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, they would sit in the mosque and they would teach, particularly Aisha al-Mu'mineen radiyallahu anha. She was known for her fatwas, and people would come to her for arbitration, for judgments, and for her teaching, public teaching in the mosque. In the generation of the Tabi'een, this tradition was maintained by people like Aisha bint Talha and Darda. Darda in particular, one of the greatest scholars amongst the Tabi'een. She dies in the year 81 and narrates some of the most important hadiths of Islam, also well known for her fiqh. We find also in this generation of the Tabi'een, one of the most distinguished students of Aisha was a lady called Amra bint Abdul Rahman. Her particular speciality, as so often with women scholars in Islam, was hadith. And we know that the Khalifa, the Mujaddid Umar bin Abdul Aziz, ordered the chief Qadi of Medina to write down all of the hadith that had been narrated on her authority. So precious and so reputable were these hadith that the Khalifa himself ordered that these hadiths be written down and preserved for posterity. And this tradition continues and blossoms, so that we find, for instance, in the 5th century, in Central Asia, near contemporary of Imam al-Ghazali, the best-known transmitter of the Sahih of Imam Bukhari in the entire Islamic world was a lady called Karima al-Marwaziyah. As her name indicates, she is from Maru, which is in Central Asia, one of the great cities of Khorasan. She was one of the teachers of al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, universally revered and respected. People would travel from all corners of the Islamic world to sit in her mosque and to hear hadith from her. And this goes on, and the numbers were very considerable. Ibn Asakir, for instance, in Damascus, lists his teachers, and the list includes 1,200 male teachers and no fewer than 80 female teachers. A proportion not that unfamiliar even to those who work in modern universities. That's about the proportion that you find of full professors who are women in most universities in England. But this is medieval Islam. Another nail in the coffin of those who like to present Islam as an irreducibly patriarchal anti-female tradition. In the heyday of Muslim scholarship, as in the early days of Islam, that was simply not the case. The tradition continued, but seems to have petered out sometime in the 13th Islamic century. The last great female muhadditha, universally known of repute in the Islamic world, was a lady called Fatima al-Fudayliyah, rahmatullahi alayha, who died about, almost 200 years ago in Mecca. Really distinguished muhadditha and great ocean of hadith and also of fiqh. Since that time, the tradition has gone into eclipse, although it was still the case 70 or 80 years ago, when Mecca was still a great centre of knowledge, that there were women hadith scholars who were teaching. And one of my teachers in Mecca, Sheikh Muhammad Yasin al-Fadani, Allah yarhamuh, used to speak of how in his youth he would study with some of the female scholars of hadith in the haram in Mecca. Those of you who have done Hajj or Umrah will assume that the structure in Mecca, the haram, is basically for people to do ibadah, but in fact, until extremely recently, a generation or two ago, it was also a great Islamic university, and people would go there to study as well as to do ibadah. But for various reasons, that has now been almost entirely brought to a standstill as the country and the region switches to Western-style universities and moves teaching out of the mosques. So these women taught in the mosques, but they also taught in madrasas, and particularly in the Mamluk period, madrasas were established for women, sometimes by women as well. Perhaps the best known in medieval Cairo was something called Al-Madrasat al-Saqlatuniyah, which was paid for by a wealthy lady, established as a waqf, and all of the students there were women, all of the lecturers there were women, and there was a musalla, a small mosque, attached to the building where the women would be led in prayers by an imama, by a female imam. One of the most distinguished, honourable institutions of medieval Cairo. In Damascus there was the Khatun Madrasa, which performed a similar function. The Zumurrud Madrasa in Halab, in Aleppo, in Syria, and elsewhere in the Middle East. So that's one aspect of classical Islamic education that we need to bear in mind, that it's easy to forget nowadays because these traditions have been so drastically eclipsed. Of course, now in many Islamic universities they have attempted to revive this by opening women's faculties. The Azhar for the past 30 years has had a Kulliyat al-Banat al-Islamiyah, but the tradition of women professors and women teachers has almost completely vanished. So much for that. Let me talk now a little bit about the akhlaq of the teacher. I mentioned that Islamic education is about human transformation, not merely about the transmission of knowledge. And the fact that it is that the acquisition of knowledge is a form of ibadah completely suffused the educational process in the classical Islamic world with a sense of the sacred. That everything about the class was treated with extraordinary reverence and dignity. It was a formal, very respectful, dignified, sober, austere, sacred experience to be present in any traditional transmission of sacred knowledge from a teacher to a pupil. It was a holy event, utterly unlike the modern American university setting, for instance, where the professor comes in and half of the students are still drinking Coke, or they've got their boots up on the desk in front of them reading the student newspaper, and the idea of this being a sacred event could not be further from people's minds. But Islamic education is about personal transformation and the experience of holiness actually in the process of of inculcation and instruction.